only Matthew. The return from Egypt and moving to Nazareth, only in Matthew. The story of the wicked king Herod who slays the innocents in Bethlehem, only in Matthew. Those are not found in Mark, Luke, or John. Now, Luke has a sermon on the plain, but Matthew's Sermon on the Mount is much larger. And later I'm going to devote a lecture to this sermon. Here are some of the high points. The 9 Beatitudes, Luke has 4 of them. Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer. Most Christians that are 4 or 5 years old can say Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer. Even most people with a PhD in New Testament cannot recite Luke's version from memory. So Luke does have a version, but it's not nearly as famous, and it has not affected Christian piety nearly as much as that of Matthew. The 6 antitheses. You have heard it said, but I say to you, those are only in Matthew. Luke has some of the material, some of it, but not the form. You have heard it said, but I say. Let's see some miracle stories. There's a healing of 2 blind men. Only Matthew has this double healing. The healing of a mute man in chapter 9 has no parallel. The story of Peter walking on the sea. John and Mark have the story of Jesus walking on the sea, but only in Matthew does Peter walk on the sea too. Then there's a summary healing story in chapter 15 of many people being healed, only Matthew, and the story of the coin in the fish's mouth. And last time I was in Israel, I had a St. Peter's fish at the restaurant there on the lake shore. Presumably the same kind of fish where the coin was, only in Matthew. There are parables in Matthew's gospel that we don't find anywhere else. The story of the weeds among the wheat growing there together and the explanation of that parable, only in Matthew. The short kingdom parables of the hidden treasure, the pearl, and the net, only found in Matthew. The wise scribe who treasures up the new and the old, only in Matthew, and some commentators think that this is his own self-portrait, these 2 little verses. The parable of the unforgiving servant, the guy who was forgiven a great debt and then had his fellow servant thrown into prison because he wouldn't pay him a few bucks. The story of the 2 sons. This is a short parable. The one that said, I'm not going to go to work, Dad. But then he changed his mind and did it. And the one said, sure, Dad, I'll go to work. But then he didn't. The longer story of the 2 sons, the prodigal and his older brother, that's Luke. But this short story of the 2 sons, only Matthew. The parable of the wise and the foolish virgins, 5 who were wise, 5 who were foolish, only Matthew. And the great parable of the Last Judgment with the sheep on one side and the goats on the other, only in Matthew. He has some special material about Peter. I've already mentioned Peter walking on the sea and the payment of the temple tax. That's what the coin in the fish's mouth is all about. And also Peter's confession. Peter says, you are the Christ in Mark and Luke. But only in Matthew does he say, the Christ, the Son of the living God, and only in Matthew do you get those letters written 6 feet high in Latin all around the inside of St. Peter's dome that we Catholics could quote even before Catholics read the Bible. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, and so on. And I say, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Is it any wonder that this is the Catholic Church's favorite gospel? There it is. Some special traditions only in Matthew and the Passion narrative, the story of the death of Judas. Now, Luke has a very different story of Judas' death in Acts, and we might compare those in a future lecture. But no other gospel has the story of Judas' death. The dream of Pilate's wife, where she says, I had a dream about, don't have anything to do with this just man. Only in Matthew. The terrible saying, let his blood be on us and on our children, that has resulted in the persecution of Jews throughout the centuries. Only in Matthew. You won't read that in Mark, Luke, or John. The story of the guard at the tomb, that there were soldiers guarding the tomb after Jesus was buried. This is not found in Mark, Luke, or John. These are Matthean guards. Only in Matthew. If you ever see a stained glass window of Jesus coming out of the tomb with his flag and the soldiers giving it this, actually, no New Testament gospel tells the story of Jesus coming out of the tomb. That's the Gospel of Peter, which didn't make the cut. But there are soldiers only in Matthew. Those are Matthean soldiers that the Gospel of Peter borrowed. Then the resurrection appearances. He has the appearance to several women. Now, John has the appearance of Jesus to Mary Magdalene, but he doesn't tell the story of Jesus appearing to any other women. In Luke and in Mark, there are no stories of Jesus appearing to women. In these Gospels, the women only get to see angels. So Matthew and John are the two Gospels that have stories of Jesus appearing to women. Mary Magdalene in John, and several women in Matthew. And only Matthew has the story of the apparition to the 11, Judas is gone, to the 11 on a mountain in Galilee, where he says, all power in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. And then we get the Trinitarian baptismal formula, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. The only place you find that is in Matthew. All the baptisms that we read about in Acts are done in the name of the Lord Jesus. It's not in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. That comes only from Matthew. This lecture I'm entitling The Structure of Matthew's Gospel. And to understand Matthew, we're going to take a very quick look at Mark, which one scholar has called a passion narrative with an extended introduction. Matthew's main source is Mark, and more on this in another lecture. Matthew reproduces about 80% of Mark. Luke reproduces about 50% of Mark, Matthew about 80%. So some more details on Mark, if we want to say more than a passion narrative with an extended introduction. We have a Galilean ministry beginning with the baptism of John. Then we have Holy Week in Jerusalem, followed by the passion narrative, and then there is a prophecy of resurrection appearances. The angel at the tomb says to the women, go to Galilee, there you will see him. Tell the disciples, go to Galilee, there you will see him. The women leave the tomb and say nothing to anybody. End of the gospel. That's how Mark ends, an abrupt ending. Now, Matthew's overall structure compared to Mark, he starts with an infancy narrative, then the Galilean ministry, the Holy Week in Jerusalem, the Passion narrative, a prophecy of resurrection appearances, and resurrection appearance narratives. So Matthew's major additions to Mark, the easiest ones to spot, are the very beginning, the infancy narratives, which serves as an overture. And I'm going to do one or two later lectures on an infancy narrative. But it serves as an overture to the rest of the gospel and the resurrection appearance narratives. And I'm going to devote 1 or 2 lectures to those as well on another day. So those are his major additions. Now, let's see. I think I've got time. If not, I'll cut it out. My experience of overtures is very limited. Handel's Messiah, Jesus Christ Superstar, and Grease are the only ones I know. But let's take Superstar for an example. When you first go the first time, it's kind of like this is mood music. But after you've seen the rock opera a couple of times, then you're listening, dun, 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 and you say, apostles' music. Dun, 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 dun. Judas music. Dun, 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 dun. Mary Magdalene music. Okay, so what the overture, it's the last part written, and it gives you a preview of the rest. The infancy narrative functions as an overture. More of that in the detailed lecture. Now, Brown's outline of Matthew is a 7-part outline. He has the infancy narrative, the origin and infancy of Jesus the Messiah, and then he has, before he gets to the climax, the passion, death, and resurrection, he has 5 additional sections of the gospel, and these are built around the 5 discourses in Matthew. And before each discourse, there's narrative. So you get part 1, the proclamation of the kingdom, and the discourse there is the Sermon on the Mount. Then ministry and mission in Galilee. You get the narrative, and the discourse that ends that is called the mission sermon. Then there's questioning and opposition to Jesus, the narrative, and we get the sermon or the discourse on parables, concludes that. Part 4, his thoughts on Christology and ecclesiology, what the church is about, the narrative, followed with the sermon or the discourse on the church. Part 5, the journey to and ministry in Jerusalem. That's the narrative. And the eschatological discourse, the discourse about the end, brings that section to a close. And then the climax is the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So, narrative and discourse, Matthew structures the material between the infancy narrative and the passion narrative with narrative followed by discourse. And the 5 discourses, I've given them here to you. The Sermon on the Mount, the mission sermon, the sermon in parables, the sermon on the church, and the eschatological sermon. Now, 3 of these are Matthew's composition, and 2 of them are expansions of Mark. So the Sermon on Parables, that comes from Mark 4. Matthew has 52 verses, Mark has 41, so you can see that's expanded. And the eschatological discourse about the end, that's 37 verses in Mark, but it's 97 verses in Matthew. Well, let's see. I'll also say just a little bit about what I mean by Matthew's composition. The Sermon on the Mount is Matthew's composition. What we find in the Sermon on the Mount, a lot of that material is found scattered throughout Luke's Gospel. Matthew has taken things said by Jesus on many different occasions, miles apart, weeks and months, maybe years apart, and put them into one thematic sermon. That's what I mean. So I'm not saying that Matthew wrote this from scratch. What I'm saying is that he took sayings of Jesus and built them into the Sermon on the Mount, and probably the same with others. So that's what I mean when I say it's his composition. Not that he wrote it from scratch, but that he's assembling different Jesus materials. Basically, what Matthew does with the extra material, he puts it into sermons, structured by theme. What Luke does is, in Mark And Matthew, the journey from Galilee to Jerusalem takes 1 chapter. In Luke, it takes 10 chapters. And so he has the story of Jesus eating and drinking his way from Galilee to Jerusalem, telling parables and dining with people along the way. And he puts the extra Jesus material that he has that's not in Mark in the journey narrative. So Mark serves as the basic structure for both of them, but Matthew handles the Mark and other material differently. Matthew is longer than Mark. We've seen Matthew has added the infancy narrative, 2 chapters, and resurrection appearances, most of chapter 28. The other major reason for Matthew's increased length are the 3 additional sermons and discourses that he includes. He has also expanded the 2 discourses that he took over from Mark. And the 5 discourses, my last remarks here, some have proposed that the 5 discourses correspond to the 5 volumes of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Brown thinks that that hypothesis is unlikely. However, there are parallels between Jesus and Moses. And these parallels between Jesus and Moses are a common feature of the Gospel of Matthew, and I will be dealing with those in a future lecture. Lecture 3. Useful tools to study Matthew. The first thing I'm going to do is encourage you to read Matthew. Any Bible is better than none. Pretend that you have never seen a Jesus movie. Pretend you've never read any other gospel, and just read Matthew from beginning to end, at one sitting if possible. Take you maybe 2 hours. And try to imagine how you would think of Jesus if you were someone hearing about him for the first time and this was your source about Jesus. Please study Matthew on your own. So this short series of lectures will only scratch the surface. You'll get more out of my lectures if you study Matthew before the lectures and after the lectures. A movie critic's comments about a great film are no substitute for sitting down and watching the film. Well, I heard the critics like it. I've heard the reviews. I don't need to go see the movie. No. It's not the same as the experience. So my lectures about Matthew are no substitute for the experience of reading Matthew yourself, or it's available in audio on the internet, of listening to it, as most of the first Christians would have experienced it, not reading it for themselves, but hearing it read by somebody else. A proverb: give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. So the purpose of this lecture is to give you some tools that will help you to feed yourself for a lifetime. Translations. We don't often think of this. We just pick up our Bible. But any translation is good. No translation is perfect. So here are some of the best Catholic translations. The New American Bible, and there's the New American and the New American Revised Edition. If we're just talking Matthew, it doesn't make any difference because the New Testament of the NABRE is exactly the same. It's only the Old Testament that's been revised at this point in 2016. The Douay Rheims Bible, that was the one that we read before Vatican II when I went to the high school seminary. I have one with my grandmother Madden's handwriting in it, to Pat from Mammo and Pap. So when I was 14 years old, I still have that. It's a wonderful Bible, but you have to be able to read English at the 12th grade level to understand it, which a lot of people who have masters and PhDs cannot read at 12th grade level. The RSV Catholic edition, if you just buy a Revised Standard Version, it's not going to have all of our books in the Old Testament. New Testament's exactly the same. Or if you buy an RSV with Apocrypha, it'll have all of our books, but the Old Testament won't be in our order. It'll be a different order. The same, the NRSV Catholic edition, a regular NRSV doesn't contain all of our Old Testament books, just like the old RSV. So RSV with Apocrypha, it'll have them all, and some extras these days that the Greek Orthodox have, but they won't be in our order. So especially for catechists and beginners, I recommend, if you're buying an RSV or an NRSV, buy the Catholic edition. The Good News Bible, this is sometimes called today's English version, the Good News Bible Catholic edition, and the Contemporary English version, which is the successor to the Good News Bible, the New Testament, and this American Bible Society translation receives explicit approval from the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Oh, and another one, the Jerusalem Bible and the New Jerusalem Bible. These are excellent Catholic translations, so I'll recommend those to catechists. And it's good to, if you're going to study a passage, teach on it or preach on it, to look at 2 or 3 different translations. Every one of them gets something, none of them gets it all. Study Bibles are Bibles with extra notes and extra introductions that help you to understand things. The Catholic Study Bible is one of my favorites, so I highly recommend that. This is put out by Oxford Press. The next one I'm going to recommend is the Jewish Annotated New Testament. This is the New Revised Standard Version translation, so it's a Christian translation, but all of the comments at the bottom of the page, all of the notes and all of the introductory articles and all of the articles at the end are written by Jewish scholars. So if you ever want to know how do my Jewish friends look at this particular story, this is a good resource. Then the New Revised Standard Version, which I've already mentioned. Oxford has a New Revised Standard with the Apocrypha in a study Bible version. The New Oxford Annotated Bible, it's called. It's worth having in your library. And the last one I'll recommend is the Net Bible First Edition with 60,932 translators' notes. If I were to be condemned to be on a desert island with only one New Testament, it would be the New Testament from this Bible. Now, if I was just condemned to be there with one Bible, it couldn't be this one because it doesn't have all of our Catholic books and they don't have a Catholic edition. As far as the New Testament goes, it doesn't get any better than the NET. Now, be careful about study Bibles. For instance, I do not recommend the Schofield Reference Bible or other things like that, which has a peculiar idea about when the world's going to end, what verses predict that. So be careful when you're selecting study Bibles. Okay, this is going a little longer than I had planned. So now that we've finished Bible translations and study Bibles, I'm going to break it here. And in the next part of the lecture, we'll pick up and do concordances and commentaries. In the first part of the lecture, we looked at different Bible translations and at study Bibles. Now we're going to take a look at concordances and Bible commentaries. Now, the next is a concordance. And first, hard copy. In the old days, a concordance is a book. And suppose you wanted to find where faith occurs in Matthew or in the whole Bible. Well, a concordance it puts all the words in the Bible in alphabetical order. A complete concordance will even do the prepositions. When I was a 7th grader, Sister made us memorize about, above, across, after, to, toward, under, until, up, with. And all of those words would be in a concordance, but able would probably be the first one you'd be interested in, all the places that mention. And what it would do, it'll take Abel, and he'll be there in Genesis, and it'll give you the verse, but then if a later passage mentions Abel. And so if you had your concordance, you would look up faith, and you would go to F, and then starting with Genesis all the way to the end of Revelation, it would give you every verse that had the word faith. And back, when I started teaching Bible and when I was a seminarian, the only way to do this was with hard copy. Now, there are electronic concordances, and I just fussed at the NCCB because their website, it's got the text, but I said, you don't have a concordance to the New American Bible. Well, it turns out, they said that they have given permission to a website called the Bible Gateway. And so now all you have to do is click on a word and bam, it gives you every time that the word occurs in the whole Bible, you can cut and paste it. So it makes it a lot easier. Also, the electronic concordance makes it easy to search for things like phrases like kingdom of heaven. Now, if you wanted to search for that in a paper concordance, you'd have to pick a word. Kingdom of or heaven. I wouldn't pick of. There'll be a lot. Okay, kingdom or heaven. And then suppose you did heaven, you'd have to go through and find all of the ones, but just highlight the ones that are kingdom of heaven. Whereas with this, you can put in the phrase kingdom of heaven, and you'd get them all in a second, and what you'd find out is that the only place in the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, that uses the phrase kingdom of heaven is the Gospel of Matthew. Nobody else. Or to search for Son of God or Son of Man, that's incredibly hard. I mean, kingdom of heaven is easy, but Son of Man, you wouldn't want to look up any of those words. Son and man are just a little bit better than of. That's hours with the paper concordance. It's about a second with an electronic concordance. So I give you the link there. Then the synopsis. The one I like is the synopsis of the 4 Gospels. There are 3 editions. The one that catechists want is this one, the English edition. I usually teach from the Greek edition, and there's a Greek-English combined edition. Anyway, it has the Gospel stories in parallel columns, in 4 columns, and you can go through and you can see here Matthew has a story. This is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. You see there's something from Mark, but it talks about Jesus on a mountain, but it's not saying anything. Luke has the Sermon on the Plain, and John is blank. His column is blank. So if you want to compare Gospels one with the other, the synopsis is the tool to do it. And if you're reading Matthew closely and you want to see, well, did Matthew just take Mark and copy it as it was, or did he make any changes? I'm going to give some lectures about changes that he likes to make. The synopsis is the tool that helps you to see the changes that Matthew is making. And when he makes the changes, that's where his theological money comes down. He changes it because he thinks he has a better idea. Then there are commentaries. Now, study Bibles, like our Catholic study Bible, which I highly recommend, study Bibles are mini commentaries. They're a Bible and a commentary under one cover. So that's the simplest thing you can do. Then there's a 1-volume commentary for the entire Bible. It's called the New Jerome Biblical Commentary. You can pay anywhere from $50 to $100 for this. Now, that's expensive for a book, but you can go and spend $50 at a good restaurant. Think of how much a TV costs, or a DVD player, or a TiVo, or the modern things. So we spend a lot more money on things that are a lot less important than biblical commentary. So if Bible study is really important to you, get a commentary. Now, the New Jerome might be more advanced than what you want. You can check it out in a library. But there is, for about $10, it's called the New Jerome Bible Handbook. And it's based on this, and it's, I believe, like high school level and easily understood. So the New Jerome Bible Handbook I can recommend. Raymond Brown's Introduction to the New Testament. Forgot to put it on here. But that counts as a commentary. Now, it's commentary on the New Testament. It has a chapter on every book in the New Testament, plus additional articles. So that's a good New Testament commentary. But then you need to buy somebody else's commentary on the Old Testament. And you have, instead of a 1-volume, you have a 2 volumes on this. So that's kind of a step up from a 1-volume commentary. And then there are multi-volume commentaries. This is the Sacra Pagina. Now, normally you wouldn't do this if you were just a catechist, but I'm just letting you know, like if you ever want to study for a master's degree or something, or take a college course, even undergraduate. Then this series put out by Liturgical Press, that's about 400 pages on the Gospel of Matthew. So when the editor tells the person you can write 25 pages on Matthew in a 1-volume commentary, and when the editor says, yes, you can write 400 pages, well, you're going to get more details in a multi-volume commentary. So one of my students once said, you can go down that rabbit hole as deep as you want. So you can start with a study Bible, kind of Bible and commentary under one cover, and you can go all the way to multi-volume commentaries. And I also give you the USCCB website on the New American Bible. If you go there, they have some articles about the Bible, and there are also daily passages, and there are comments and sermons from scholars and pastors. So it's a nice site if you want to poke around there and get some Catholic stuff. So the proverb, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. These tools will help you feed yourself for a lifetime. Now, concerning Matthew, our author, Papias, who wrote in the 2nd century, I have this quote from Raymond Brown. About 125, Papias wrote, Matthew arranged in order the sayings in Hebrew. And Brown puts Aramaic. Papias doesn't know Hebrew, and Hebrew and Aramaic are written with the same alphabet. And each one interpreted or translated as he was able. We don't have Papias's original, but Eusebius, who wrote in the 4th century his ecclesiastical history, he wrote that down. So Brown says on page 158 above, I deliberately printed Papias' reference to Matthew in its actual context following the reference to Mark, a sequence that would not suggest that Papias thought that Matthew wrote before Mark, as many later fathers of the church did think that Matthew wrote first. So the fact that Papias discusses Mark before he discusses Matthew might indicate that Papias thought that Mark was first. Anyway, he says the sayings in Hebrew. Now, at one time, people thought that Matthew must have written the whole gospel in Hebrew, and then it was translated into Greek. But the problem is that it's obvious that Matthew's Greek is not translation Greek. This is something that was composed in Greek. Papias was early, just within 40 years of Matthew. We don't want to just write him off completely. Some say, well, maybe he was writing about what we now call Q. More of that later. But Q was written in Greek. Well, some say, well, maybe the very beginning of Q, when everything was still in Aramaic, before it got translated into Greek, maybe those were the sayings that Matthew wrote. And Brown says, well, maybe, but that's trying to explain something that's unclear by something that's even more unknown. And so his judgment, with which I concur, by way of overall judgment on the Matthew issue, it's best to accept the common position that canonical Matthew was originally written in Greek by a non-eyewitness whose name is unknown to us, and who depended on sources like Mark and Q. More on them in a minute. Whether somewhere in the history of Matthew's sources, something written in Semitic by Matthew, one of the 12, played a role, we cannot know. Maybe, maybe not. So, from the scholar's point of view, on the Feast of St. Matthew, Apostle and Evangelist, we're honoring two saints in heaven. We're honoring the Apostle who walked with Jesus in Galilee in the 30s and who was one of the 12, part of the ministry. And we're also honoring an anonymous third-generation Christian who wrote the gospel that eventually, sometime in the 2nd century, scribes put the title, The Holy Gospel According to Matthew. So, to sum up, most Catholic scholars are convinced the first gospel in our New Testament was not written by one of the 12 apostles. It was not written by an eyewitness to the ministry of Jesus. Rather, it was written by a third-generation Christian, probably in the 80s, whose name we do not know. Perhaps he knew the Apostle Matthew and was influenced by him. Perhaps not. We cannot be sure. In any case, this author has given us an inspired portrait of Jesus. To compose this inspired portrait, he relied on various sources, oral and written traditions. We will examine the details about these sources in a future lecture. We'll say our prayer. You graciously grant to Adam knowledge, and you teach Enosh understanding. Graciously grant us from yourself knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. Blessed are you, O Lord, who graciously grants knowledge. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. This lecture is going to be about the baptism of Jesus. In an earlier lecture, I mentioned that the gospel synopsis is useful as a study tool. I like to color code my synopsis, and when I'm color coding the book, I never use ink. I always use a colored pencil for two reasons. It's too easy to make a mistake, and secondly, the ink bleeds through the page, whereas the colored pencil is perfect for the job. So in my color-coded synopsis, everything that's the same word for word in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is red. If it's in Mark and Matthew but not Luke, that's green. Mark and Luke but not Matthew is purple. And Matthew and Luke, but not Mark, that's blues. That's my system. You can pick whatever four colors you like. Material that's left uncolored in each column after you've done this is unique to that evangelist. If it's uncolored in Mark, that means neither Matthew nor Luke touched it with a 10-foot pole, and you start wondering why. If you read closely, usually you'll find out why. Sometimes it's just he's a little wordy or something, and so they chop it. But anyway, so here we have my translation of the Greek of the synopsis. Let's read through Matthew's version. Then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to John to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? But Jesus answered him, Let it be so for now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. Then he consented. And when Jesus was baptized, he went up immediately from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And lo, a voice from heaven saying, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. So in this story, John baptizes Jesus. And in our color-coded version, what is red and green, Matthew has taken over from Mark. The uncolored material in Matthew's column is unique to his gospel. So let's take a look at the unique material. Matthew sees problems in Mark's story. Number one, normally the master, the teacher, baptizes, and the disciple, the pupil, is the one who's baptized. That's the first problem. And the second problem is, what kind of a baptism is this? It's a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Well, why would Jesus undergo such a baptism? There you have the two problems. Now, in a modern text, we would probably take care of this with footnotes. A modern author might clarify Mark by the use of a footnote, but footnotes had not been invented in New Testament times. As a matter of fact, I give you. In fact, the New Testament did not separate words from each other. Furthermore, there were no lowercase letters. Okay, so putting in footnotes would have been impossible. But an ancient author might clarify by inserting dialogue. That's the ancient equivalent of a footnote. The dialogue expresses the truth, from our Christian point of view, that Jesus is much more important than John the Baptist. So the dialogue between John and Jesus, you will notice that it's absent in Mark and in Luke. A tape recorder present at the baptism would not have recorded this conversation. It has been added by Matthew. If I was going to go longer, I could point out the Matthean vocabulary and the Matthean stylistic traits, but there's no time in the lecture, or I'll just go on forever. So Matthew is not recording history here. He is dramatizing the truth. And dramatization is not falsification. Dramatization makes the truth memorable. Our modern footnotes have many advantages, but one of the disadvantages is often they never get read by anyone. Well, that's a disadvantage you don't have to worry about in the ancient technique, where instead of a footnote you insert dialogue that everyone will read. The next point, the descent of the Spirit. As Matthew tells this story, this is a private vision of Jesus. Note it says he came up from the water and he saw the Spirit descending from heaven. Matthew is following Mark. By contrast, Luke makes this a public event. He says that the Spirit descended in bodily form that is visible to everyone. Most Christians, when they read the story, are thinking in Lucan terms, even when they're reading Matthew and Mark, who tell us that only Jesus saw the Spirit. One advantage of color coding is it helps me, it forces me to read carefully. Some people are blessed. They can read carefully, just naturally. Color coding helps me. More on this point. The reader knows more than what In Matthew, the only character in the story who knows about the Spirit's descent is Jesus. The reader knows more than any other character in the story. So when you're reading Matthew carefully, ask, how much do I know? Did the characters in the story, did they know that? Or do I know only because the narrator is helping me out? Because the narrator is telling me things that the narrator was not there to tell the original participants. The next point, the heavenly voice. In Mark, the voice addresses Jesus. If you read it closely, it says, "You are my beloved Son." Mark imagines that the voice from heaven reveals to Jesus who he is. He's the only one who hears it in Mark, and it's speaking to him. In Matthew, the voice is a public event. It is addressed not to Jesus, "You are my beloved Son." It's addressed to the crowd. "This is my beloved Son." The voice in Matthew does not tell Jesus who he is. The voice in Matthew tells the crowd who Jesus is. Christology means, how does a writer understand the person of Jesus? A Christology that stresses the humanity of Jesus is called by scholars a low Christology. By contrast, a Christology that stresses the divinity of Jesus is called a high Christology. All four Gospels are written with post-resurrectional insight. Matthew does not want to give a lesson in history, how the people understood Jesus at the time he was baptized. He wants to teach people what he understands about Jesus. And for Matthew, Jesus is his risen Lord. Matthew's Christology is higher than Mark's. Throughout the Gospel, we will see that the Matthean Jesus knows more than the Markan Jesus. Just one example, the Markan Jesus goes up to a fig tree to see if it has any fruit on it. The Matthean Jesus goes up to the fig tree, but he doesn't need to get close to see if it's got fruit on it. He knows. The Markan Jesus, when he's touched by a woman in the crowd, turns around and says, "Who touched me?" Not the Matthean Jesus. He knows from the first moment who it was who touched him. He turns right around and addresses the woman. No question, "Who touched me?" The Matthean Jesus knows more than the Markan Jesus. And in other lectures, I will call attention to other ways in which Matthew's higher Christology affects his teaching. We would say from our theological perspective, how it improves his narrative. The Pontifical Biblical Commission in 1965, goodness, this is 2016, it's been over 50 years, issued a statement on the historicity of the Gospels. And although this statement has been official Catholic teaching for more than half a century, I never cease to be astonished by how many priests, deacons, and catechists are surprised when it is explained to them that this is not the radical idea of some scripture scholar. This is the official teaching of the Catholic Church. The material we read in the Gospels is the result of a three-stage transmission process. Stage one contains the words and deeds of Jesus. These would be things that Jesus said and did during his public ministry in Galilee and Jerusalem. Public ministry is important. The material in the infancy narratives is not covered by the Pontifical Biblical Commission's document, nor the material in the resurrection appearance narratives, only the public ministry. An example would be the story we've just looked at, Jesus submitting to baptism from John the Baptist. Stage 2 is the preaching of the early church. And it's good not to be too clerical about this. Back then there was no canon law saying that clergy could preach and laity could not. A lot of preaching was informal. An example, suppose there is a woman who is a slave in a household. She's a Christian slave. And another slave woman, her little boy is sick. And she says, did you ever hear the story about Jesus and how he healed this little boy who kept falling down into the fire and everything? No, who was Jesus? So she tells, and he healed this little boy, and now he's risen from the dead. He's up in heaven, and if we pray to him, maybe he'll heal your little boy too. I guarantee you, if that little boy gets better, there's going to be somebody else at church next Sunday. So a lot of what we call the preaching that went on in the oral stage between the ministry of Jesus and the writing of the Gospels was very informal. And then, of course, when people got to church, there would be formal preaching too. The third stage, the writing of the evangelist. And an example of stage 3 material, we find some of it in the story of the baptism of Jesus, as we find in Matthew. The Matthean dialogue between John and Jesus, that was created in stage 3 by Matthew, and the change in the words of the heavenly voice, where the voice is no longer addressing Jesus, but it's addressing the crowd. This is a stage 3 change in the tradition. Now, Matthew is conservative. He preserves the story of John baptizing Jesus. We say, well, yeah, but let's not take that for granted. Luke doesn't. If you read Luke's story carefully, the baptism, when all the people were baptized and Jesus was baptized, it's in the passive voice. Luke doesn't say who did the baptism. Furthermore, in the verse immediately before the baptism story, Luke says, you want to know how wicked Herod was? He was so wicked that he even locked up John the Baptist in jail. Next verse, now when all the people were baptized and Jesus was baptized. So in Luke's story, John the Baptist is in the pokey when Jesus gets baptized. That's Luke's way of taking care of these problems that Matthew saw. Luke saw the same problems. He took care of them a different way. And if we look at the Gospel of John in chapter 1, Jesus doesn't get baptized by anybody. We might call him John the Baptist, but in the fourth gospel, he doesn't baptize Jesus. The only function of John the Baptist is to give testimony. I have seen and I testify that this is the Holy One of God. But the story of the baptism is not found in the fourth gospel. When I used to teach at the seminary, I would tell the seminarians, now I'm going to read through the story, and you say stop when Jesus gets baptized. And I'd read through the story, and I get to the end, and I said, no one said stop. This is what I mean by reading the Gospels closely. So Matthew is conservative. He preserves the story that John the Baptist baptized Jesus, but he's also creative. He's not just recording history here of John baptizing Jesus. Rather, he is dramatizing the truth that Jesus is way more important than John. And remember, dramatization is not falsification. Dramatization makes the truth memorable. I'm entitling this lecture, Matthew's Sources. So, a review. In an earlier lecture, I pointed out that the author of what second century scribes call the Gospel according to Matthew was not one of the 12. He was not an eyewitness to the ministry of Jesus. Rather, he was an anonymous third-generation Christian who used sources, written and oral, to compile his gospel. So a contemporary analogy. Remember how, as a school child, you used an encyclopedia as a source to write a report. If you went to college, you learned to consult multiple sources when you were doing a term paper. Maybe you even interviewed people for your term paper. This would have been the equivalent of consulting oral tradition. Now, the two-source theory. Since the end of the 19th century, scholars have come to the conclusion that Mark is the first gospel to be written. And since that conclusion was made, more commentaries have been written on Mark than on the previous 19th centuries put together. The idea was that Mark was the Reader's Digest version of Matthew and Luke. Then why spend a lot of time reading Mark when you can go to his sources? Once scholars realized that Mark was the first gospel to be written, in the 20th century, more commentaries were written about Mark than all the other centuries put together. Mark serves as one source for Matthew and Luke. The second source is Q. It comes from the German word Quelle, which means source. So Germans invented this theory of how do we get this word-for-word correspondence in Matthew and Luke if neither one of them copied from the other. And the theory is they had this source called Q. If an Englishman or American had invented the theory, he would have called it S for source instead of Q for source. By definition, Q is material found both in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. So I give you a diagram of the two-source theory. You see Mark and Quelle, Q, and the arrows from both of them lead to Matthew and Luke. This is the simplest form, and then this can be expanded to include the material that's found only in Matthew, which is M material, and the material found only in Luke. Scholars call this the L material. So then you end up with two major sources and two minor sources. The M material, since this is a course on Matthew, which is what interests us here, is the material that only Matthew has, and I treated that in my very first lecture, so I won't go into it again here. Q is mostly sayings. When this theory was first proposed in the 19th century, which would be the 1800s, people said, well, would anyone ever write a gospel that was only sayings, no miracles, no story of the birth of Jesus? People said, well, Mark doesn't have the birth. No story of resurrection appearance narratives or empty tomb. So people were skeptical, but then in 1945, at a place called Nag Hammadi in modern-day Egypt, they discovered the Gospel of Thomas. We knew from the fathers of the church that this gospel had been written, but this was the first time we ever got to see it, and Thomas consists of 113 sayings ascribed to Jesus. Nothing else. No passion narrative, no miracles, nothing that Jesus did, no passion narrative, only sayings. And this made the theory that there was a document called Q more believable. And it's still a theory. John Meyer says when every New Testament story gets up in the morning and makes his or her act of faith, he or she needs to say, yes, I do believe in Q. But to remind ourselves that this is precisely that. It's an act of faith and scholarly judgment, but the idea that we can know details of Q, that is what I think far-fetched, and I won't say any more than that about it at this point. So Q is easy to find if you're looking at a gospel synopsis with the 4 columns. This will become obvious in the next lectures. We will look at the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes, and both of these are from the Q source. So my next lecture will mimic the layout of a gospel synopsis. So that'll be the next lecture.